It's currently in vogue for college coaches to criticize teenagers and for not being tough enough or not caring enough about winning or whatever. Today's rant is. Yesterday, I read an article by a college coach from some school I've never heard of, who was writing about how entitlement and how college players aren't ready to perform at the college level because they've never been criticized or yelled at before. And obviously, this coach has never been to a youth sports event because if there's anything that defines a youth sports event in today's era, it's that there's constant yelling, both by coaches and parents. And so when we talk about, children developing into adults and being fragile, or, the idea of the nation of wimps, things like this, it's not because an absence of yelling. To me, it's because there's immense pressure from the time that a child is basically born, from their social environment, starting with their parents, then extending on to their peer groups, the schools, their teams, their coaches, etc. There's immense performance pressure, and there's immense anxiety from parents and coaches to avoid critical mistakes. And so that ends up as behaviors from parents and coaches in terms of constant yelling, almost sometimes critical, but oftentimes trying to be instructive, trying to get athletes to avoid a mistake. So preemptive yelling and screaming in some cases. I watched or I refereed this past weekend an under 14 game, and the coach of the team has played in multiple World Cups, and he didn't shut up the entire game. He was the typical PlayStation coach, as Innovate FC says on Twitter, and all he did was yell at players. Some of it was trying to, preemptively avoid a mistake. Some of it was retroactively criticizing a mistake. Some of it was yelling at players and telling them it's their fault that they're losing, or that goal was their fault, or that play was their fault. Attribute and blame. But he yelled the entire game. And I would say that behavior is more common in what I see in youth sports and high school sports than the opposite of that, which would be a coach who more or less doesn't say much during a game, parents who more or less don't say anything during games, and players are just allowed to play and perform. And then maybe after the game they receive some instruction or feedback on their performance from, a parent or a coach. That I almost never see. And over the last couple of years, I've refereed some 400, 500 odd soccer games. I've been to hundreds of basketball games, both coaching, watching, recruiting. So I've seen a fair amount of youth sports over the last, really the last 2 decades, but especially the last, 2 or 3 years, seen multiple sports. And this idea that children don't get criticized or children aren't yelled at, and that's why we have whatever problems we want to associate with that when they reach adulthood, to me is completely missing the point and completely incorrect, because all there is at a youth event is yelling and screaming by parents and coaches. And to me, that's the biggest problem in youth sports, is the constant yelling and screaming by the coaches and parents, because it takes away the players' opportunities both to learn on their own, because they're constantly cued in to their parents' voice or their coach's voice, looking over their shoulder, seeing when they're coming out of the game, seeing if their mom or dad approves or disapproves of what they just did, because it's constant. They can't get away from it. They're brought up in this environment from their earliest days in sports, where that's viewed as appropriate for some reason. And so, these behaviors don't allow the players to learn on their own, And they don't allow players to make mistakes, because as soon as a player makes a mistake, that coach is yelling at the player and taking them out of a game. So mistakes are, uh, they're unacceptable. And so then players, play scared to an extent because they're trying to avoid making a mistake and getting taken out of the game. Or getting yelled at by a coach, or getting yelled at by a parent, or getting yelled at by a teammate's parent, which I've seen. So there is definitely an issue with players or children reaching towards adulthood, and this idea of the nation of wimps, and some form of fragility, and these things that people are talking about. But I don't think it's because they're not yelled at or there's not pressure on children. I think a lot of it is because there's immense pressure on children. But there's also this immense safety net from parents trying to avoid having their child fail. And so it's that combination of the intense pressure. I mean, when I was playing as a child, nobody cared we cared if we won or lost, but then, after the game was over and we went on and did something else, and then we forgot about it. It wasn't a big deal. And our parents weren't obsessed with whether we won or lost games. They would yell on the sideline like normal parents, but no big deal. Now you go to games and there's parents fighting in the stands, which I've seen multiple times. Parents have to be separated and sit on different sides of bleachers. And it's not a rare occurrence. It's something that's happening, almost every weekend. Parents are fighting. Like, that's absurd behavior. And it kind of feeds into the same thing. The pressure that everybody in this environment feels to be successful is so much greater than when I was growing up. And so because of this pressure, it creates these other negative behaviors. The yelling, the screaming, and the really trying to not allow mistakes, and to make players perfect, and to make them almost robotic, so that their behaviors are anticipated, and their behaviors are the same every single time. And consequently, as they grow into adulthood, they lack some adaptability, because they're used to this one thing, behaving in this one way. Now they have to adapt to different things. They get to a point where they don't have their parent there to yell at them and to try to prevent that mistake, or to go and complain to a teacher when they do make a mistake. And now they have to adjust, and they haven't developed these coping skills because the parent has always been there. That's the fragility that I see. That's the fragility that I think is talked about in things like the Tiger Mom book, and the Nation of Wimps and stuff like that. But it's not because there's an absence of yelling, or there's an absence of criticism in youth sports. Youth sports is overflowing with negativity. And in the end, to me, that's the biggest problem.